Hello, everybody. My name is Modal. I would like to welcome you all to this event this afternoon. I'm the Wolfson Professor of Criminology at the Institute of Criminology of the University of Cambridge, and I am the director of its Violence Research Center. It is my great pleasure today to welcome you to our first Beyond the Headlines webinar. In the Beyond the Headlines webinars, we aim to engage with a wider academic and non-academic audience, including people engaged in policy, in current topics related to crime and criminal justice policy. Today's speaker is Dr. Paolo Campana. Dr. Campana is Associate Professor of Criminology and Complex Networks at the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, and he is a member of the Violence Research Center and a great colleague of mine. Dr. Campana holds a PhD from the University of Torino. Before he joined the University of Cambridge, he was a research fellow at the Extra Legal Governance Institute at the Department of Sociology at the University of Oxford, and he was also a fellow at Nuffield College. Paolo's work specializes in organized crime and forms of extra-legal governance. Other areas of interest include trust and reputation, mechanisms of cooperation in illegal settings, and specialized research on organized crime. Moreover, Paolo has a strong interest in the application of network analysis techniques to the study of organized forms of criminology. He is currently working on the issue of trafficking and smuggling of human beings into Europe, the movement and emergence of mafia-like organizations, and their impact on local communities. In addition, he is investigating the mechanisms underpinning corporate fraud. His recent work has appeared, amongst others, in the British Journal of Criminology, Theoretical Criminology, the European Journal of Criminology, Crime and Justice, and many other academic journals in our field. His work has been translated into Chinese, French, and Italian. Today, Paolo will talk about human smuggling across the Channel. He will speak for about 20 minutes, and that is then followed by questions and answers. Please use the question and answer feature in Zoom to ask your questions. You can also like questions that have already been asked by others in the audience, and then those questions will move up in the hierarchy of questions, and it will help us to understand which questions are considered most relevant in our audience. I really look forward to this talk. Paolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you for this very nice introduction. And I am pleased to be the first speaker of this new seminar series that we have launched. In a sense, responding to the events that happened last, in the night between the 24th and 25th of November, and the tragic event in the Channel. So we thought, well, why don't we do something slightly different, and we'll take a little bit more time to explore current phenomena going beyond the headlines. And the idea being that often in the news, well, there is no time to go deeper and try to have a more complex discussion about current phenomena. So I'll put on my slides, and I'm really pleased. I was looking at the chat. I am really pleased to see that we have people from different countries in the world, and people from the two sides of the Channel. So we have people from Britain, and we also have people from Belgium, including a prosecutor, person from the Federal Maritime Police, and a professor from the Netherlands, Edward Clemens, so that I also say hi to him. Now, please do feel free to contribute to this discussion, also from the other, so to speak, the other side of the channel, and I'm sure you have more element and different element from what I will put on the table. Now, what I am going to do, I'm going to start from the headlines. I'm not going to present results of specific work that I have done in the past on human smuggling. If you are interested in any work that I've done on the network of the smugglers operating across the Mediterranean, or the broader macro level mechanisms of human smuggling, etc., please do feel free to email me. I haven't put my email on the slides. You can find me at the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge, and find my email address, which is PC, like personal computer, 524@cam.ac.uk. Now, let's start with the headlines. So, in the spirit of this format. Well, what happened in the night between the 24th and 25th of November is that one of the small boats that have been crossing the channel for I would say 2-3 years now, but really they really increased the number of crossing using small boats, really increased in the last year. One of these journeys had ended in a tragedy, and the boat sank, and 27 people died after the inflatable boat capsized and sunk, apparently deflated. We still don't know the reason, whether it was because it was bad quality, whether because it was overcrowded, whether because the boat hit a boat, like a larger vessel. This was the first explanation for what happened, but apparently, according to the French maritime police, that was not the case. Now, as you can see in the deadline, this was referred as the biggest loss of life in the channel, meaning the English Channel, or La Manche for the French speakers. And just to give you a sense of what the places where we are, the places we are looking at, well, here you have a map where you have France and the UK, and the center here is Calais, which is the port city, and Calais Dover is where the channel probably is not the shortest point, crossing point, but this is where the channel is at its shortest length. In fact, in a sunny day, in a good day, if you are on the beach in Calais or somewhere near Boulogne-sur-Mer, just next to Calais, you can see the British coast. So in a sense, you have Britain there in front of you. Now, what you also have here, you have a long, very long stretch of beaches. And the beaches in these areas are mostly dune and other type of beaches that are very difficult to police. So here we are talking about a stretch of land that goes for more or less probably between 150 and 200 kilometers. Now, the approximate location of the sinking, of where the boat sank, you see it on the map. And at the very beginning, it was unclear whether the boat was still in French water or in English water. And it turns out that the boat was still in French water. Now, this was reported as the biggest loss of life in the channel, which is true if by channel you mean the stretch of sea that separates France from the UK. But actually in 2019, in October, 39 people died while they were crossing from Belgium to the UK in a refrigerated container. So they were at the back of a lorry. The nationality of the people who died in 2019 they were mostly Vietnamese, and this is a picture of the lorry once it had arrived on the British side of the channel. Now, what we have seen this year, and this is a picture from BBC using data from Home Office, we have seen a steep increase in the number of crossing using small boats. Now, we have seen slightly more, almost 26,000 identified migrants who successfully cross the channel. And there is a steep increase if you compare it to 2020, and an even steeper increase to 2019. Now, if you just look at this picture, you might be forgiven for thinking that something new has happened and something big has changed in the channel. So you might think, well, this is the emergence of a new phenomenon. Well, this is actually not true, because while it is definitely true that the number of people crossing using small boats has increased over the years, and also the speed of the increase has gone up. As you can see, the red line is 2021, so it's this year, compared to 2020, which was already an increase on 2019. This is not entirely new phenomenon. So what has changed is the way people cross. So what has changed is the way that smugglers operate. Because the fact that there is a large number of people in France, in the north of France, around Calais, that is willing and waiting and trying to cross the channel, well, this goes back to at least the end of the 1990s, when a first refugee camp was opened by the Red Cross in Sangatte, which is near Calais. Now, the camp was closed in 2002 under pressure from the then Labour government in the UK, and also led to a number of agreements between France and the UK on managing the border. Now, the closing of the camp didn't completely solve the problem of the crossing, because what happened then, a new camp, a makeshift camp, was established. And this camp was not run by any organization like the Red Cross, but it was a makeshift camp that just grew out of the initiative of the migrants themselves. And then NGOs and charities started to offer some basic services in the camp. So the first camp, which then was known as Jungle, was there around Calais between 2002 and 2009. Then again, it was dismantled. And then a second camp called the second Jungle, kind of open in inverted brackets in 2014. And it was then demolished in 2016. Now, this is a picture from BBC of the Jungle in September, the second Jungle in September 2016, when the camp was covering a fairly vast area next to Calais. And it's a camp that I actually visited when it was still there operating. You can see some container, and that part was the part that was reserved for women and children. Now, this is to say that, in a sense, what we are seeing now, as when we see the numbers, we are basically seeing the effect of a phenomenon that is much more visible now than it used to be before. Because the crossing back then used to be made at the back of a lorries, or in a sense, they were more likely to be undetected. Now, the big difference between small boats and the back of lorries, and this applies also to the Mediterranean or to the sea between Turkey and Greece, is that small boats are much more visible and they are identified. So the people who cross in small boats are more likely to be identified than people who cross at the back of lorries. The reason why, of course, we don't have the full evidence for this is, but if we look at, first, we can see that the demand for crossing has always been there. So it's not that it's something new. And second, if we look at the issue from the other side, so from the asylum applications in the UK, well, you can see here, and this is until 2020, so we still don't have 2021 in the figure. You can see that are pretty much stable since 2003 to 2004. Yes, there are some fluctuations, but they are pretty much stable. And of course, asylum applications do not encompass only small boats crossing or people crossing the channel. They include all applications, but in a sense, as you can see, there is some sort of stability there. So my point here is that we have witnessed a modal shift, and there is probably some evidence for that, a modal shift, not an entirely new phenomenon, but just a different modus operandi of smugglers. And the changing modus operandi is due to the fact that over the years, the security and checks in ports have increased. If you have traveled through Calais, but also if you have traveled to other French ports like Ouistreham in Normandy, and I'm sure the same applies to Belgian ports, you will see that there are fences and new cameras and heightened security, a deployment of the French police or the French gendarmerie. So in a sense, there is much more security control. So what happened there, you had first a modal shift from the back of the lorries to containers. Containers increases the chances of not being detected because it's more difficult to open a container than just checking a lorry. Then there's been installations to capture, for instance, the temperature in the container. So smugglers have shifted to refrigerated containers. That makes it more difficult to check the presence of migrants. But when something goes wrong, can go terribly wrong, as we saw in October 2019. And in the case of the channel, smugglers have started to adopt a modus operandi that had been already adopted elsewhere. So the use of boats, for instance, can be traced back in the Mediterranean, can be traced back decades. The use of boats has been documented in the crossing between Greece and Turkey and Greece, as well as crossing along what is called the Western Mediterranean route, which basically means crossing from Morocco into Spain. So in a sense, it's nothing new as modus operandi. It's just that before, we haven't seen it before in the channel, and since the other more modes of transportations have become more and more difficult, smugglers have changed their modus operandi and started to use the small boats. Next, how deadly is the channel? Now, of course, this is hard to say. It's hard to say. We have some estimates. So according to media sources, 41 people have died since January 2021, including the 27 that died in November. Of course, here, every single loss of life is a tragedy. And in a sense, human smuggling is a difficult subject, because when we talk, all of us, we talk to migrants, you can see the hope in the eyes of the migrants, the willingness to find a protection, to better their life, and really a tale of human hope and human tragedy. Now, I have to take a step back and use a more drier language in discussing macro level policies here. But let's keep in mind that we are talking about human beings with their experiences and hopes. Now, how deadly? Well, 41 people died since January 2021, according to the International Organization for Migration. 166 people died since 2014, and 300 people have died since 1991, according to an NGO which is based in Calais. Now, again, every single death is too much in a sense, but we can also say that compared to other routes, compared to the Mediterranean routes, particularly Central Mediterranean routes, and other routes for which we don't have very good data, for instance, crossing the desert, the Sahara Desert, the channel still remains, again, many inverted commas, I wouldn't say safe, but a less deadly deadly route than others. Now, next, I just want to say a little bit about how smuggling works. Now, instead of me describing how smuggling works, I have here the testimony of one person, one survivor of the deadly crossing, the October 2019 deadly crossing that led to the death of 39 Vietnamese people. Now, witness X, this is the testimony during the trial, said that the container was transported across the channel from Belgium to Essex. And this person had flown first to Poland using a legitimate visa in February 2019. Let us remind ourselves that the tragedy happened at the end of the year. So we are talking about fairly long journey here. But the first long leg is done by plane on a legitimate visa. Then the person, probably this visa was connected to a course in Poland, so it took a business course before traveling to France, and then started to communicate with another person who had made it to the UK and posted photograph on Facebook. Here it's interesting, it's not the first case, and it's interesting that we see the role played by technology and social media in not only coordinating and facilitating exchange between migrants and smugglers, and between migrants and migrants, but also as a way where smugglers can advertise their services and where information circulates. Then we see that we see an intermediary person that kind of liaise between the migrants and the smuggler using an encrypted phone app called Viber. Basically instructed the person to go to a flat in France where 13 people were assembled. Then they were picked up by an English person, and they were moved into the container. They were provided waters, and they were warned against using their cell phones for fear that the cell phone signal would be picked up by the authorities. Now, the journey was a little bit delayed, and that was the reason why there was a lack of oxygen. It lasted for between 7 and 8 hours. And then it was picked up. It was made to wait in the flat of a Vietnamese man, and the driver asked, like as you would do, like almost like a travel agency, and said, "Well, do you like this country?" And then, well, he said that he decided to cross, to make this journey because he wanted a better life for his children, despite knowing that the journey was illegal. And he said, well, I'm going to go to the Home Office to apply for my papers. I mean, I think this is a vivid testimony of the crossing. And again, I look for from some evidence related to the November 2021 deadly crossing. And according to media sources, the Associated Press, the smuggler behind the organization of the crossing has been identified with a pseudonym. Reportedly is an Iraqi Kurd, and the vast majority of the identified victims are also Iraqi Kurds. And the journalist from the Associated Press was able to talk to the brother of one of the victims, and the brother showed messages from the smugglers, and the smuggler was saying that he was on the run in Germany, and he sent a vocal message and say, well, I'm sorry, what happened was a surprise also to me, and I will compensate you. And it's not the first time the smugglers compensate families for what happened. I encountered the same behavior from smugglers in relation to another deadly crossing in the Mediterranean that led to the death of 366 people. The smuggler behind that deadly crossing was wiretapped by the Italian authorities, and he also was saying, well, actually, I compensated the families of the victim. Now, why are they doing that? And what is the big picture behind human smuggling? And I will conclude with this. I say a little bit, a couple of things about the big picture and then policy implications. Well, first of all, human smuggling really is mostly demand-driven. So in a sense, the demand for the crossing is not created by the smuggler. Smugglers tend to respond to a demand that is created by a number of factors. And this can be factors like war, Syria, the conflict in Syria or Afghanistan, or instability in other places of the world like Eritrea or Iraq, generates demand for movement, as well as demand for movement related to economic reasons. Now, what's interesting about the smugglers and the smuggling market is that they can adjust very quickly to a rise in demand. And I have observed for instance, in other papers that in the Mediterranean, you can have a rise in the number of crossing by a factor of by 1,500% year on year, or even more. So in a sense, these are markets that they can adapt, they can expand very quickly in a rather short period of time. Why? What is the reason for that? Well, the reason is that, first of all, there are low barriers to entry. So in a sense, it doesn't take a very high level of resources to become smugglers. It is a fairly low skill type of job, and also fairly low capital requirements. In a sense, all you have to do in the case of the crossing between France and the UK is to invest a little bit of money in buying the inflatable boats. But that's pretty much it. In a sense, you have very low setup cost for newcomers. You just need a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit. And actually, many of the smugglers have a background as entrepreneurs, some legal entrepreneurs, other illegal entrepreneurs. It's also a market that is characterized by no monopoly. So you have competitions, you have multiple smugglers operating at the same time, and they will supply slightly different type of services, smuggling services, but in a sense, they might compete, and they are really, really careful about their reputation and to make sure that they keep a good reputation so that they can attract more clients, more migrants buying their services. Now, competition and the fact that you have multiple smugglers that can easily replace each other, in a sense, it's a bad news for law enforcement. And this explains also why it is difficult to just target the smugglers in one place, like Calais. In fact, if according to the data released by the French authorities, well, in 1 year, 1,552 smugglers has been identified by the police. But as you can see, this has had very limited impact on the increase in the journey, precisely because smugglers are replaceable. What's also interesting about smuggling, and I think this is an interesting phenomenon, is that smuggling now operates based on a separation between the place where the crossing takes place and the place where the payments take place. And this is thanks to some well-developed financing traditions, for instance, Hawala or other sorts of traditions, which basically means that you can be in Calais and you can get on the boat in Calais, but you don't have to have the money with you. So the transaction can well happen between, for instance, Birmingham and Berlin. And in one case that I studied, the crossing was between Zuwara in Libya and Lampedusa in Italy, and the transactions happened between Sweden and Israel. That is actually an interesting separation, interesting mechanism, but also another massive headache for law enforcement. What's also interesting is that if we look at around the world, like beyond the channel, beyond Europe, smuggling markets, and really I use the term markets because these are like really markets in which the commodity traded is the movement from A to B, illegal movement, so in breach of the law or outside the law, if you prefer. They show a remarkably similar arrangement around the world. And the groups that operate in these smuggling markets tend to be generally small. Now, we don't have a clear, actually, I don't have a clear evidence-based. Probably law enforcement have better data, but certainly my hunch is that this group will probably have 2, 3, maximum 5 core members and some aides, but we won't see like very large, highly sophisticated, highly structured groups. And And there is very limited involvement of mafia type organized crime. These are actually separate groups that they tend to specialize in human smuggling. If you look at the headlines, you always hear like, oh, the mafia, the Mr. Big, the kingpin. Well, there is no such thing as a mafia. If we mean by mafia a structural group that controls a certain territory, we don't really have this. And secondly, there is not really such thing as a Mr. Big. Had it been a Mr. Big, it would be much easier in a sense for law enforcement, but there isn't. Now to the policy implications, and I stop. Well, first of all, human smuggling is connected to a host of moral dilemmas. Moral dilemmas because you have a number of unintended consequences. We have seen it in the Mediterranean. You launch the rescue operation, which was a very noble thing to do. And what you see is that you have smugglers changes their modus operandi and using smaller and smaller boats and doing more launching more boats, with the risk of increasing the possibility of incidents. Now, there are a number of moral dilemmas, but ultimately, when we look at smuggling, we look at finding a balance between enforcement, so enforcement against the smugglers, and protection of migrants. And really, the crux of the issue here is the balance between the two. You will normally have a mix between enforcement and protection, but the mix that you decide to have is also a political decision. Because if you think about what politicians talk about all the time, which is bringing death in the channel to zero, well, you can reach this point in two different and opposite ways. You can do it in an ideal world as with max enforcement. So every single crossing is stopped, so there are no deaths at sea. Or you can do it with max protection, again, another ideal word, and you pick the word you prefer. Of course, I have a preference as a citizen, but as a researcher, I put the two words on the table. Max protection, every single migrant is allowed to safely reach the UK in this instance, but you can change UK with any destination country. Reality is that we will be somewhere between these two opposite words, where we have some sort of mix. Of course, it's also a matter of finding a way of minimizing harm. And this is a very last slide. We also need to remember that what happens in the channel is just one leg of a wider and more complex phenomenon. So in a sense, we have mechanisms at place at different stages and at different levels. So we have events in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Eritrea, in Sudan, well, in Vietnam, you name it. Well, then you have events that happens en route. If you have seen the latest event, for instance, what happens in Belarus has had an impact on what happens in Calais and in the Channel. Some of the migrants who died in the crossing and some others who are currently in Calais, they came through Belarus using the charter planes that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has chartered. Well, then you also have a micro level mechanism. By micro, I mean related to the place of crossing, meaning Calais in this case. So what happens if you increase security at the port? What happens in terms of modal shift and the local displacement effect? And finally, let's not forget that all this happens within a broader framework of rules and regulations, including alternatives. So local conditions in the destination countries matters, as well as alternatives for people who wants to move from A to B. Direct relocation settlement schemes from war-torn zones or other countries, as well as a number of other mechanisms that we can certainly discuss more. This is just to give you a sense of the complexity of the issue, that sometimes you don't get it when you read or you listen to politicians that tend to portray this as a black and white phenomenon. And the phenomenon, that the way it's portrayed is the following. You have the bad smugglers. So the bad people in the story are the smugglers, the horrible people. And don't get me wrong, I think that there should be enforcement towards unscrupulous smugglers. Then you have the poor migrants, helpless migrants with no agency almost, that they don't know what they are doing and they find themselves on the boat. And then you have the state as a rescue and the savior that kind of saves the migrants and stop harm from it happening. The reality is much, much more difficult. The state needs to be the enforcement. The state also plays other roles. I stop here. We see that we have a lot of Q&A and chat and questions, very long. I'll do my best to read them and go through them. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Thanks, Paolo. Thanks a lot for this really interesting talk. Different questions have come in, but I will start with the first two questions. For some strange reason, I can't open question and answer, so Simon is copying me into the questions that come in. But there were two questions that I thought are really interesting at the beginning. The first question was about the role of social media, and whether you think that social media increase the likelihood of human trafficking. And then we had a question by Lu Liu, who I think got up at some crazy time because she's currently in Shanghai. I can't even imagine what time it is over there. And she asked you about this issue when you talked about human smuggling being a low resource and low skills activity. And I think she made a really interesting point, saying that in comparison, at least to other crimes, human smuggling is rather complex because you need to solve all kinds of logistically complicated problems. You were talking, for instance, about the issue of making sure that the money is paid. You need to organize people coming over long distances and make sure that this entire network of activities functions. And so she was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on this issue of this being a low skills.
Yes, well, thank you, Manuel, and most of all, thank you for the questions, to the people who put the questions in the chat. Now, on social media, play a crucial role, not just the way we have to think about that is that we have offline and online communities. So what social medias do, they create online communities. And in human smuggling, the word of mouth, the circulation of information is really important. Now, imagine if we look at things from the migrant's perspective first. From a migrant's perspective, you have multiple smugglers. And what you want to do, you want to make sure that you are choosing the right one, a trustworthy one, a good one, because it's a free market. It's a market that Chicago economists would only dream of, with no intervention of states and regulators. Now, that means that no one checks the quality of what is offered. You have fraudster, you have unscrupulous smugglers. Now, you want to collect information, you want to check the veracity of the information, you want to exchange tips and elicit more feedback, in a sense, from people who made it. Social media allows you to do all of this. Of course, they don't substitute face-to-face and information coming from people that you know, so like friends of friends, family friends, etc., etc. But over the years, social media have increased their role, and I wrote a paper on that. From the smuggler perspective, social media is a way to advertise their services, and you have many groups on Facebook. I remember the National Crime Agency in the UK had put a number of groups they have identified. I might be completely wrong, but I think it's in the region of 1,000. These are groups where smugglers really advertise their services and where people can ask questions, etc., etc. So yes, technology plays a role, and of course, the technology plays a role when it comes to coordination on the ground. Now, now I move to the issue of low skills, low capital requirement. In a sense, by low skill, it is true that there is some level of sophistication in the operations. But what has happened is that, in a sense, all you need in terms of skills, it's an ability to organize logistics. If we compare it with other type of illegal markets, like drug markets, where you need to produce the drugs, you need to run refineries, you need to import chemicals, you need to find container shipment, and then you need to deal with, and also you need to invest a large amount of money to buy the shipment of drugs or to set up a cannabis factory, etc., etc. So this is what I would call like more higher capital requirement. In terms of skills and in terms of resources, you need probably the most difficult type of organized crime to run is the mafia type organized crime, where you want to control a territory, you want to control, you want to govern both legal and illegal markets. So in a sense, yes, there are certain skills there, but it's skills that you can acquire fairly quickly, also because there is an established tradition of smuggling, particularly in certain areas, hotspots, or in certain places. So in a sense, that's why I said, while it's difficult to become, it's not that easy to start to become the godfather, and there are not many godfathers in the world. It's much easier to become a smuggler.
Paolo, there are lots of other questions coming.
Yes, please.
I'm not going to be, I don't think we have the time to look at them all, but I'm just going to read them from bottom to top as I go through them. So Bianca Ritter asked whether the separation of the payment system and the crossing service imply an enlarged, a higher risk of human trafficking. So because you induce debts. And she also asks in what way smuggling networks are connected to forced labor, sexual services networks. Well, can I just add, just for the sake of time, hopefully you can remember all the questions or you can read them. Then there was a question by Edward Clemens, who asks about the other side of the channel, what it looks like in terms of legs of the journey to the UK, how important France is in comparison to other countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands, which of course then leads me to the question, which is connected to this. Given that we had in the headlines so much discussion about the spat between France and the United Kingdom, what would it be that you think would need to be done differently to avoid this kind of tragedies? So, and then we can go further up the list if you have more time.
Yes, so I'll try to give a short answer to all of them. So the relation between human smuggling and human trafficking. So let me say, first of all, for those of you who are not familiar, there are these two concepts, human trafficking and human smuggling, and both derive from the from UN protocols. And human trafficking is basically control over a person for the purpose of exploitation. Human smuggling is the facilitation of movement from A to B in breach of the legislation of country B. Now, these are two separate phenomena. However, they might be linked by exploitation. Now, the key element there is exploitation, and I wrote a paper on that. That basically you need to ask the question: who is exploiting whom? Now, you might have situations where a migrant decides to hire smugglers, has to pay a lot of money for that, and then end up being exploited, not by the smuggler, because the smuggler, in a sense, I think the smuggler, if they can choose, they prefer not to be involved in exploitation, because that adds complexity to the operation. In a sense, if you think about that, it's much, much easier and much, much more valuable for a smuggler to just organize a crossing, put 50 people on the boat, and then forget about the 50 people. If you are involved in the exploitation, well, that means that you need to monitor the 50 people for the next 3 years. Now, there is limits to that. And I think my research on human trafficking and other colleagues, and Edward Clements also can say more about this, is that probably you can monitor 5 people, you can probably monitor 20 people, but you won't be able to monitor thousands of people. So that means that the smugglers and the traffickers, broadly speaking, are separate. Then you can always find the exception, but I think that would be the exception to the rule. Then we had the question of, yes, Edward Clements from the smuggling routes. Now, I suspect, so we don't see, as far as I know, we don't see many small boats between Belgium and certainly the Netherlands. It's probably too far. In fact, we don't see small boats between Normandy and Brittany and the UK. It's probably too far. Although there might be shifts, because we have seen shifts in the modus operandi in the Mediterranean. Probably the main ways that smugglers operate in Belgium and probably in the Netherlands is still containers and lorries. Now, in terms of legs, if we look at asylum applications, France still processes, I think, 3 times more asylum applications than the UK. So that means that the journeys that makes it to the UK are much fewer than the journeys they make to France, to Germany, and potentially also the Scandinavian countries. Although I don't have the numbers for this from Sweden. Sweden has received a lot of asylum applications in 2015, 16, and 17. I'm not sure about 2020, 21. So in a sense, from the UK perspective, the numbers, well, geography matters in a sense. So it's more likely that the journey will end before reaching the UK rather than going all the way to the UK. Manuel points on, well, the spat between France and the UK. Well, I think there is only one way, and it's cooperation. There is no other possibility here, because, well, for many, many reasons, but all the actions that have been suggested that are non-cooperative with the neighbors, mostly France, but you can also include Belgium and the Netherlands because it's a space. And now you can also include Germany, because we know that some of the smugglers are in Germany now, and they operate out of Germany, as well as out of the UK. So some of the smugglers are based in the UK. So every action that is non-cooperative with these neighboring countries is doomed to fail. And not only that, it will backfire. Because also the cooperative actions that are taken on the ground. And let's not forget that the British border is currently in France, and the French border is in the UK, due to a treaty that has been signed in Les Touquet, that creates these juxtaposed borders. And you see it when you take the Eurostar, because you pass border control, you pass the French border control in London, or the other way around, you pass British border control in Paris, à la Gare du Nord. So, in a sense, and you also have a joint team that was set up in Lille to exchange information between the two countries. So there is a lot of cooperative actions going on. So being non-cooperative in this space, I think in game theoretical term is actually a bad equilibrium, and bad equilibrium for the country, and possibly also bad for, well, certainly for migrants as well, because there also you have cooperation in the rescue operation.
One last question, which I think is very brief, but I thought it was a very interesting question. I don't know who asked it, but somebody said that the term human smuggling entails quite a black and white Manichaean view of reality. And the person was asking, what do people being smuggled actually, what term do they actually use? How do they describe what is happening? Do you know?
Now, that's a good point that the question makes. In a sense, we have to look at where the human smuggling definition comes from, and it comes from a protocol to the Transnational Organized Crime Convention of the US. So it originated within the transnational organized crime domain. That's why you see then human trafficking and human smuggling. And it's always important to look at where the concepts come from and the context in which they originated. And I agree that actually this concept of human smuggling can lead us to think in these black and white terms, that there is the bad smuggler and then there is the smuggled person. In fact, we have people with agencies. We have people who make decisions. We have people like the migrants. I think the migrants will see themselves as migrants, even when they buy the services of a smuggler. But the migrants might have very limited options. So in a sense, well, in rational choice terms, you have an opportunity set. And for some migrants, this opportunity set is larger than others. And that what makes a difference is the money you have. Not all migrants are equal. Some migrants are wealthier than others. The education you have. No, in a sense, the more you pay at the margin, I think the more likely it is that things will be easier for you. And the journey will be smoother.
By the way, it's interesting what you're saying, because that actually answers also another question that we had earlier on, where Jazz Payne was asking exactly that question. What is the relationship between how much you pay and what is the quality?
Of course, things can go wrong. So in a sense, you can have instances of people who have paid a large amount of money and then, well, in a sense, they found themselves on that boat that sunk. But if you can pay more, for instance, there have been cases in Turkey of people using yacht. They have what was called a VIP service. If you were willing to pay more, you could get fake identity documents. Notoriously, Italian identity cards are one of the most counterfeited ones. Unfortunately, because then every time I show my identity card, people look with some suspicion. But that because the old identity cards were easy to forgery. Now, that's one element. The other element that is not just money, is also education. Now, the more educated you are, the more access to technology you are, and the ability you have to collect information and to judge the veracity of the information, well, that puts you in a better position, which basically means that if you choose a smuggler that you know from the community, smugglers that has a stake in the community life, it's probably more likely that that person will try to stick to the promise. But if you choose a last-minute smuggler in the camp in Calais, a person that has no link to you and in a sense has really no stake into your life and in his reputation, I use his because they tend to be male, that's where the risk increases. Again, complexity, and it's really not black and white, and there are options, there are decisions, there is agency, there is also limited resources, there is limited opportunity, there is tragedies, there is people fleeing and people looking for better life, hope, and moral dilemmas.
Thank you so much, Paolo. This was very interesting and very useful. Unfortunately, I think both you and I agree, and probably many in the audience agree, that the issue of refugees and human migration will continue to be one of the most pressing issues that will confront us both in the UK and across Europe. And so finding humane solutions to this issue remains a very pressing problem. So thanks a lot again, Paolo. Thanks a lot to all of you who have attended. The talk will be put online for those of you who have not been able to attend today. We really look forward to seeing you again in future webinars on looking beyond the headlines. And for now, I just wish everybody a very good evening. Thank you very much.